of research that I've been doing with my colleagues on a report a few years ago called Women Can't Win. And I want to speak to that a little bit because, you know, we've almost been fed a theory, right? Or fed a story that's not true, a fairy tale. You get up, you go to school, you get your education, you do well, you get your job, you're successful, right? That's what they tell us. That's the fairy tale. But for many, the walk towards that goal of success is not necessarily a straight run. And for many, the pathway can be very perilous. And as Amy has demonstrated, we also have, you know, other things to deal with, such as discrimination, that have nothing to do with your capability, your competence, and how you perform in your job, but it's just the economic environment, the social environment within which we must function that also determines our success. So let's talk a little bit today. Oh, and she told me to turn this on first. There we go. To set the tone for today's conversation, right? So I just want to give you a few points for us to think about. And the first is, for the past half century, post-secondary education has taken on an increasingly important role in career preparation in the United States, with profound effects on the life experiences of young adults. So we know for the past 50 years or so, and I've been around for almost that long, I'm going to say exactly how long I know, I probably look at. But, you know, I guess since I've been alive, post-secondary education has taken on an increasing role. And how do we know this? We know this because having a college credential has become much more valuable in the labor market and much more expensive. We have many jobs that are actually specifically asking you for your college credential. And most often they ask you for this as an indication of the embodied skill or your embodied knowledge that this credential is supposed to demonstrate. So, okay, you have your BA and your BSc, and this embodies some sort of competency, skills. We're hoping, so we're going to hire that sheet skin and hope that you can perform. But too many young adults are taking on significant college debt, only to be left struggling to latch on to good jobs. And I'm saying this in the context even of the administration's statement today that they're going to make it much easier for us to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy, which is something that has been taken away for the last 30 years or so. So that is amazing news. It's just flying under the radar, but I'm hoping we'll speak much more about it. Moreover, the educational attainment gaps between demographic groups represent substantial barriers to economic, racial, and gender justice. Despite this, we know that virtually every measure of socioeconomic well-being and success is highly positively correlated with education. From positive earnings, so your personal earnings, your share of full-time employed, how long you're employed, your health status, you live longer if you're more educated. The likelihood of incarceration is much lower if you're educated. Job security and satisfaction is also higher the more education you have. So we know that there's this high correlation between education and economic success. And it really flies in the face of this current narrative where people are asking you, well, is an education still worth it? Is college still worth it? Should you go? In the face of all of these positively correlated outcomes with college education, we know that it is still worth it. So we have to, even in this environment, keep telling people over and over again, yes, it's worth it. Here's why. Make sure they go. Make sure they complete. Make sure they have access, right? So here are a couple figures now to demonstrate it. We have median earnings rise with each level of educational attainment. So this is something you know. There's a hierarchical relationship between your education attained and your degree. So the more you take, the more you make. That's more or less true. And I say more or less true because there are variations within education levels. So even with professional degrees, there's a median and there's a distribution. Some people earn less, some people earn a little bit more, and then you find that there's overlap. And especially with doctoral degrees, and I have personal experience, that you don't necessarily make as much as some with a professional degree. And there's some master's degrees that earn more. There are some bachelor's degrees that can earn more depending on where you are. So it's important for us to have that information. Which ones? And I think, you know, higher ed educators have a hard time with that question. Which ones? Because the moment we start talking about which ones matter, which ones work, which ones are going to give you that pathway to growth and economic opportunity, what educators fear is which ones won't. So they think that what you're doing is closing the door to opportunities for literature, Shakespeare, and all of these higher fields of learning. And what we're saying is, no, we're not closing any doors, we're just letting people know what's there, what's what. So you have that full information. And as we spoke about in the last hour, you have that transparency so that people can make good decisions about how they're moving forward. So, 16% of high school diploma holders and 28% of associate degrees holders can earn more than half of workers with BAs. Knowledge is power. You have to know which ones. It's important. So you can't just say, okay, I'm going to go with a BA, and I'm just going to do it, I'm going to do an AA. You have to know which ones, and you have to decide on where is your career pathway. And part of doing that is really having access to the appropriate level of counseling and information ahead of time, so that you can make good decisions ahead of time. And you're not going to end up with so many people. Ever so often in the newspaper, you see an individual with $100,000+ in student loan debt, a job that's not giving them the ability to pay, a whole bunch of college credits that they're paying for that they never use, doesn't even work towards a degree because they took extra credits that they didn't know they didn't need at that time, and a lot of waste in the system that can be curbed if people had more transparency and more information early on. Here's a conversation about gender. Men have higher median lifetime earnings than women at every corresponding level of education, but women and men's earnings still over that significant. So here's, the gender wage gap we were talking about. Amy didn't specifically say it, but at most measures, the gender wage gap is somewhere around 82 cents on the dollar. That's how it's measured. And that 82 cents on the dollar has nothing to do with education. It doesn't control for education. It doesn't control for your occupation. It doesn't control for your status, your labor force status, whether you're part-time or full-time. It does not control for if you're in the union or what industry you're working in. There's no control. Just take all the men, all the women, line them up, take the average, and see how much they work. But even when you control for some of these variables, and even when you take women who are equivalently educated, working in equivalent occupations, you still have women earning 92 cents on the dollar per person. So what we talk about is given that we know that there's a gender wage gap, let's talk about where are the opportunities to close that gap. We talked about in the last hour, where there was a discussion in the intellectual and caring professions such as teaching and nursing that are female dominated. How come men still earn more? Yes, they do. In the case of nursing, and then we have Arda, who's our nursing expert at our center. In the case of nursing, men earn more because men are much more likely to pursue master's degrees in nursing. And men are much more likely than women to also complete their nursing graduate degrees, so some sort of graduate degree. And they also engage in fields of nursing that are much more highly paid, such as psychiatric nursing. Okay? Somebody has to be able to restrain that individual, and that's a job that sometimes requires a little bit of brawn, and women are much more interested, we found, in, can you tell me, what branch of nursing? Say it? Absolutely, you absolutely, right? I still feel that way, pediatric care, because that's where you find the preponderance of women with an interest in that field. So it's not a criticism, just a definition. All right, so I want to quickly change the subject a little bit, because we talk about the role of education. We talk about how important education is to opportunity. We talk about all of the correlates with education and social well-being, social development. But we have to exist in a country where race still matters. And I think when I was talking about this particular slide, when I was writing this slide, and I have a significant amount of information here, so I'll tell you what's on. I was being very sensitive to the current Supreme Court decision that is addressing the ability of institutions like Harvard and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to base their admissions on some sort of race-based definition. So with that now at risk, the question is, will we be able to still have the amount of diversity, equity, inclusion on our American college campuses as we've had in the past, particularly in the selective schools, but all other schools as well. And here, we're talking a little bit about how race matters. The first graph on the left in black just talks about college enrollment by race, ethnicity. So, on average, you have 64% of the high school graduating class of Asian students are enrolled in college within a couple of years of graduation. And once you get down there, next you have whites, Hispanic, Latinos, blacks, two more races, Pacific Islanders. So we do have some disparity in what happens the year immediately after college by race. The year immediately after high school by race. So what happens by race right after you leave high school to go to college. Then when we move to the graph at the top right, this is telling us a little bit about 6-year outcomes, right? And after 6 years, for those who are enrolled, 6-year outcomes by race, Asian, Black, Hispanic, white. And I just want to pick just one. So let me just pick Asian, which is the second bar. And this tells you 6 years later, 20% are not enrolled, 16% are still enrolled, 12% completed a different institution, and 51% completed at their own starting institution. And that compares to 43% of the overall groups, but only 28%, so just point your eyes to blue, 28% of the black students are completed at the same institution, 35% of Hispanics, and 47% of whites. And that has implications for how much you remember in student loans, how long it's going to take for you to graduate, whether or not you're moving to other institutions, how much of your credits are transferred, it's all related to cost. So once you have all these transfers, there's a cost association. So we get down to the graph at the bottom right, which is talking about student loans by race. And here's a graph that tells you if you are Hispanic and Latino, then 21% of you will owe about $10,000 in student loan debt 1 year after graduating. But close to 30% will owe between $25,000 and $40,000. If you're black, then 30%, 28% will owe between $40,000 and $60,000. If you're white, then I'm going to look at the pink. 27% will owe between $10,000 and $25,000. So Asian students have significant debt as well. If you can just look at the pink, this is $25,000 that's on here, 32%. And then we have it broken down by multiracial or Hispanic, Native, Hawaiian, so that particular graph is showing you what's the distribution of how much you owe by the time you graduate when you enter college. And we find that minorities are owing more. Why? They owe more because they started taking larger loans than anyone else. They owe more because some of those loans are not subsidized, so they're at higher interest rates. They also owe more because they start off in jobs that might pay a little bit less, so they're paying less later on. So we have accumulated debt. So the question is, we are encouraging everyone to go to school, get your degree, go to college, make sure you get your education, because we know for the last 50 years, education has been much more closely associated with all these measures of success, but there are a lot of potholes along the way, a lot of barriers along the way that we have to overcome. Class matters too, but race and class are not the same thing. And I always have to say this because a lot of people often try to intertwine them and say, well, okay, if we can't get race in admissions, we'll just use class. You're not going to get the same thing. You can't get race without race. And as much as there are high degrees of correlation between race and class, they still are different because you have some students of color, irrespective of their social standing, irrespective of the caste, which is something that we saw in the previous conversation, are still going to have negative outcomes because when you walk into a room, there are certain things that are visible to you that will always be visible to you, that will always act as a disadvantage in a society that has created them as a disadvantage. So certainly colleges should strive for class diversity along with racial diversity. But class disadvantage and racial disadvantage are distinct problems with different roots and different impacts. So I want to talk here a little bit about education and income. Again, if you were to look at, we have two columns here. The top, 60% of earners and the bottom 40% of earners. And if you look at the top 60% of earners, a significant amount of them have graduate degrees and bachelor's degrees and associate's degrees. Okay. So once again, depending on your education, we have another high correlation between education and earnings. As the higher your education, the much more likely you are to be in the top 60% of earners in this country. We can then subdivide those two big charts by race, ethnicity, and you find that graduate degrees, high school, or if you were to look at Asians and just the yellow color, 25% graduate degrees, white 13%, other 12, black 8, Asian. Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, 6, Hispanic, Latinx. The number is a little bit smaller than 6, there's about 5% in there. If you can do the math and figure out the percentages of that. So this is giving us a high degree of correlation between educational attainment and race. And I was looking at the yellow, at the top, which is graduate degree, but if you were to look at the light blue at the bottom, that also tells you a big story. It tells you a story that says that 60% of our current Hispanic Latinos have attained high school or less, compared to 48% black, 32% white, 25% Asian. Why does it matter? It matters because of the changing demographics right now of society. It's becoming much more minoritized. And in fact, depending on which cohort we're talking about, high school cohort and the younger cohorts, they are already a majority minority towards towards Hispanic Americans. So this means that we have a large cohort of Hispanic Americans that are undereducated, disproportionately undereducated compared to the rest of society, that we have to do something about if we are to be able to find jobs of the future. So here's our good jobs chart. And even good jobs. So we were just talking about jobs, just getting a job. Even good jobs are highly correlated with race and ethnicity. And here we have a chart that just lines them all up and tries to figure out, okay, here's the share in the labor force of the big jobs. Who's at the top? Asian American men, Asian and Asian American men, then white men. Asian American women, multiracial men, white women, multiracial women. And as you come down, you see that Hispanic, Latino men, Black, African American women, American Indian, Alaska Native women, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, are least likely to have access to a good job. This chart doesn't tell you about education, but there's a lot of information and education that's embedded in there. And if you recall some previous charts, a couple charts before, we had a high degree of correlation between one's education and one's race. So now they're telling you about one's race and access to good jobs. So in a transitive way, we know that there's a high correlation between having access to a good job, having access to the appropriate level of education, and one's race. So this is why you get this outcome. I love this particular chart because this tells us that insofar as we know we have to train more and more students, so we have to make sure that more and more people get a degree. Within the United States itself, we have a system where people have self-selected into colleges and universities in a way that is biased by race and class. So between 1995 and 2009, 82% of all new white freshmen went to the 468 most selected colleges and universities. So you have self-selection here. You have this self-selection of white students going to the most selected schools. And you have the self-selection of 72% Hispanic and 68% Black students going to the open access and community college schools. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Well, this is telling us something about opportunity in the future. Because we're creating the society that is very much hierarchical by race and ethnicity, depending on people's access to education. If everyone, by virtue of their race, is self-selecting into these particular universities, then the outcomes are also going to be reflective of race and ethnicity. Okay? So what we find in the long run, we find that more and more Black and Hispanic students are going to open enrollment schools that are usually underfunded, that have less access to resources to ensure that people complete in a timely fashion, and usually lead them to outcomes that involve having more student loan debt. So how do we deal with this? How do we sort of, go into this pipeline and remove some of these arrows and put them in different directions so we have a more equitable outcome? That's the challenge. We really want to have an equitable outcome so that everyone can have opportunity. Because this is a conversation that most people don't want to have. Because they're just happy with making sure we have more and more students in college. And say, well, where are we sending you to college? Are you telling me it's okay for certain people to go to some college and certain people to go to another college? Because that's tracking. And it's fancy 2022 tracking, but it's tracking nonetheless, and it's still unacceptable. And we still need to find ways of making sure that we don't track, whether it's self-selecting, whether or not it's individuals themselves saying, I don't know if I can go to a more selective college university by virtue of who I am. I think I want to go to this school that undershoots my potential. Then we have to usurp that in some way and make sure that we don't have Black and Hispanic students undershooting their potential. We make sure they go to the schools to which their influence are going. So, selected public colleges spend on average almost 3 times as much for full-time equivalent students in instructional and academic support as open access public colleges. And with 3 times as much, you would expect those graduation rates to look like that. Right? So, we often spend a lot of time, I think, talking negatively about community colleges, talking about the graduation rates we support, without pointing the finger at how much money, they're using. What are they doing with the money that they have? Okay? So, when you spend 3 times as much, I expect you to graduate 99.99%. You're spending that much more per piece. Despite all of the conversations we've been having about the role of education, how important it is for us to have more education, how highly correlated education is with all of these outcomes, positive outcomes, college enrollment is still down. And this happened way before COVID. We didn't always blame COVID, right? Even before COVID, less and less people are going to college. Every other day, the newspaper is a conversation about should we go to college or shouldn't we go to college? Maybe I shouldn't go to college. We're not going to go to college. But is college worth it? And I mean, I'm not trying to totally disregard all of these statements. Because of course, we all know the cost has risen exponentially since the 1980s for various reasons, right? We no longer have as much allotment from federal and state sources, and what they're doing is putting the burden of tuition back on the families, the individuals. But at the end of the day, enrollment is still down, and we need to do something about enrollment. And here, we're going to end with one of the recommendations. We have to embrace our country's diversity and reject racial and ethnic gender injustice. So in other words, you have to make sure to understand that this country is racially diverse and make sure that we allot enough resources for those. Apply an equity lens to all policies and programmatic reforms by measuring. You have to measure it. You have to measure this inequality. You have to have statements about it. You have to say how much it differs. We have to tick all of those boxes and know how many people fit in those boxes, how many people don't, and how much it costs and what's the difference. So we can have open, honest, and transparent conversations about the cost. Provide targeted educational, social support to young people from cradle to career. So for individuals, you have to find them from early childhood courses, early childhood education, all the way through. Don't just wait until you're in college to say, well, okay, maybe you should do this, maybe you should persist in this program. All the way through. Invest in programs that treat college and labor markets as a single system. You know you go to college for different things, but most of us are going to try to get a better job. So treat them as a single system. Extending from early childhood to the first good job, including those with strong employer investments. Help young people. Help young people pursue and attain their education and career goals simultaneously using career exposure and work-based learning. So make sure they're exposed early to things other than what's in your community, to make sure that you can see other types of programs that you have access to. And not everybody wants to be a football player, or my nephew wants to be a rapper, or video games. They all want to be a video console designer. Just expand those opportunities beyond that so you can see what the options are available. Create a transparent database education and career navigation system that's accountable for making outcomes more effective and equitable. And then finally, just make college more affordable and more convenient by investing in free college. We had a whole conversation in this previous election about free college, but we can still have that conversation about it. We're still advocates for it. Continue to talk about free college. Thank you for your time. Are you ready for your quiz?